I want you now to take yourself away from the hustle and bustle of the city to a small resort community that has become something of a ghost town. A grisly crime haunts the town's streets and psyche more than 40 years after it occurred. That's the setting for How They'll Tell It, a play debuting tonight at the Gargoyle Theatre in Winnipeg's West End on Ellis Avenue. Written by Dauphin playwright Sophie Gias, the play is directed by the pride of Oakville, Manitoba, Cali Sproule. Cali joins us in the Classic 107 studios to give us a preview this morning. Wonderful to see you here, Cali. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, without giving too much away, what is the story of How They'll Tell It about? We alluded to this grisly crime that takes place in this fictional community in rural Manitoba.
Yeah. So How They'll Tell It takes place, as you said, in a fictional community called Waska, Manitoba, loosely inspired by Wasagamine in Riding Mountain National Park. And 40 years ago, in 1985, there was a attack, a cannibalism attack perpetuated by these two. Perpetuated by these two women, and in How They'll Tell It, we flash forward to 2025, present day, and we meet these other two women who are in Waska, Manitoba now. And in the 40 years since the attack, it's become kind of abandoned. Lots of people have left; they couldn't stomach it anymore. And now there's a real estate agent who is trying to spruce up these cabins and sell them for dirt cheap and really revitalize this town. And we meet these two women, Ivy and Celia, who are sprucing up these cabins for sale. One of them is a true crime YouTuber, and they want to tell stories of this cannibal attack 40 years ago and find a fresh twist on it. Yeah.
Okay. So this has been a production that has been in the works between you and the playwright now for the better part of a couple of years, I understand. Where did the idea for this show come from? Because I can't imagine that you were thinking about, you're just sitting around and, you know what we should write about? Rural cannibalism.
Yeah. So actually, interestingly enough, it started out as a novel about 5 years ago that the playwright Sophie Gias wrote. And she wrote this novel, and what she really was inspired by was she's from Dauphin, Manitoba, and is the family member of a provincial court judge, and was really struck by how commonplace tragedy can be in a small community, and how perpetrators of crime are in your grocery store. They bag your groceries for you, but also their commonplace conversation. And I, growing up around Oakville and Portage la Prairie, similarly, gossip is so commonplace and so easy to take over conversation. And so she wrote this novel that it was actually a slasher, and there was murder. It was really awesome and intense. There's no more murder. And then about 2 years ago, she was like, "Oh, can you read this novel? I'm writing it, but it's not really functioning. I think that it has to be a play." And we're like, you know what? Heck yeah. And so we started workshopping it.
So it's really interesting to have this rural angle on theater that now gets taken into a more urban sort of a context. What maybe are you, when you're contemplating what the story is hoping to get across about these sort of unique relationships that you describe, what do you think that a Winnipeg theatergoer will take away about these conditions that you describe in a rural context where gossip is prevalent and does how many more times damage than it would in a larger community? Not to mention that violent crime, though certainly rarer in a small community, has, again, that sort of outsized impact.
Yeah, well, there's a few things, and I think in How They'll Tell It, there's kind of two characters, and one is a local character, and the other would be non-local. And so Ivy and Celia are both characters from out of town. Ivy is from Winnipeg, and Celia is from Toronto. Celia is the true crime YouTuber. And so it's so interesting because even though this is an intimate story, Celia is putting these videos up on YouTube throughout the play, and you get to watch these YouTube videos. And there's this idea of community reception. But then for a Winnipeg theater goer, what I think is really interesting about this play and what Sophie has done is these intersections of queerness and cannibalism that's prevalent throughout the play. And so what I mean by that is that when you have this idea of the cannibal, you have this idea of a monster. Similarly to when some folks think of queerness, they have this idea of the monster. And with cannibalism, it's interesting when you think about historical instances of cannibalism to survive and historical instances where it's been used to perpetuate racism. And so it's really interesting looking at the queer identity and the cannibal identity, which sounds funny. And you strip that away and you say, well, what about the human in there? And like what story is in there? And the big question with how they'll tell it is, what stories do we own and what stories can we tell? Yeah.
So in addition to the queerness aspect of this show and the rural component of this show that we've spoken about, there's obviously also a big Manitoba component to this show taking place in a community based on Wasagaming, as you mentioned, in Riding Mountain National Park. And both you and Sophie, the playwright, are Manitoba artists. Maybe you can speak a little bit to how the language and the setting of this province shines through in a production like this. In other words, how do you think it would be different if you did your master's studies in directing in Calgary, you were mentioning before we went to air? How do you think this show would be different if you were staging it in Calgary in an Alberta context versus having a Manitoba voice shine through this show?
That's a great question. Because I do feel that this piece is distinctly Manitoban, and perhaps that's because of the world that we've set it in. And we use some mixed media in the piece, like projections for these YouTube videos, and we have actual clips that Sophie's mom took for us from Wasagaming to help through the budget of indie theater, bring alive rural Manitoba for the audiences with Manitoban landscape. But contextually, I guess it's just that I think for Manitobans, there's a different context for cannibalism that I perhaps won't get into, but I think that it feels distinctly Manitoban, and also the cast is all local Manitobans as well, which is great. And Sophie has a real knack. She wrote a play, called 40 Below that was at Winnipeg Fringe last year. That took place in Winnipeg, and she has a real knack for writing pieces that take place here and that welcome us into our own community, which I think is really beautiful. There's not a lot of work that takes place here, right?
You touched on the DIY nature of indie theater and also of maybe being in Manitoba also, like there's just this extra quality of like pulling productions up by the bootstraps and just putting them on, telling our stories. And you talked about taking pictures in Wasagaming, all hands on deck, family included. Maybe you can speak a little bit also to, you wear a lot of hats in this show as well. You're the director, you dramaturged, you help to make the play work even better than just the original script. I understand you also maybe designed sets.
Yeah, for the first time.
So that's so interesting too, that there's this DIY quality to all of this. What are maybe as a director some of the advantages to being able to control so many of this production's elements yourself, as opposed to if you're in a larger sort of collaborative environment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have always loved about theater is how collaborative it is. So I think in an ideal world, it would have been my dream to have more hands on deck to really add to this vision. But being able to design the set for the first time, I think one of the beautiful things about indie theater is that there's just, you don't have the space for that. And so you have to handle more things. But because of that, I designed a set for the first time and I learned. And you become really good at being scrappy and utilizing other team members to really fully realize a production, it's really beautiful.
The company that is putting on this play, What If Theatre, has not. It's still relatively new. There's still a lot that you can imagine is coming down the pipeline for you guys? What do you think putting on How They'll Tell It will be able to equip you for in the years ahead? In other words, what has putting on this show maybe allowed you to dream of doing as you think about this young company's next steps?
Yeah, I think that it's what's the word I'm looking for? Pardon me, but it's a history, right? So I think that as we've worked for the last 2 years and we've worked on a few projects together, we slowly build a credibility as a company and as artists ourselves, an emerging artist, right? And it equips us to have just a better credibility and history with grant bodies, people that could work with us in the future, and for other projects to handle ourselves. Like, we know we've really started to learn the ropes of what it means to self-produce and to do independent theater, which is really great.
So maybe then that's the nuts and bolts of being what you're learning as a theater company. How does this production teach you how to tell uniquely Manitoban stories as you contemplate next steps?
Yeah, I mean, for myself as a dramaturge, my job is to support the playwright in helping fully realize their dreams, the story they want to tell. And so with Sophie, who is such a fantastic writer, and so intellectual, working together is so wonderful. And I think that as a dramaturge, you do a lot of research, and you think a lot about reception. How will the audience receive this? Like, how does this come across? Is this what you want people to feel in this moment? Because this is what I feel when I read this, are kind of questions and conversations that I would have with Sophie. And so when we're creating something that's distinctly Manitoban, as a dramaturge, my job is to think about, like, well, how is this received in Manitoba specifically? How is the typical Winnipegger or Manitoban or rural Manitoban going to receive this, and thinking about the communities that are going to be coming and seeing this show, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This show, How They'll Tell It, runs starting tonight until June the 8th at the Gargoyle Theatre. Tickets and more information can be found at thegargoyletheatre.com. You can also follow What If Theatre on Instagram for more information. They are at What If Theatre. And of course, we'll have more information on this production later on this morning at classic107.com and on the Classic 107 app. Cali Sproule, such a delight to have you here in the studio with us today. Thank you so much for telling us more about How They'll Tell It.
Thank you.